Hey everybody, it's Ian. And if you knew what take number this was of this episode, you would disown me. Okay, so today I'd like to talk to you about some comparisons I did. I guess you could call it a shootout of some modern high-res digital reissues of records versus their 40 to 45-year-old analog originals. Um, the idea came from discussing this record with Chris Bellman. Chris Bellman cut the lacquer on this 2018 reissue of Richard and Linda Thompson's Shoot Out the Lights. Sounds awesome. When I talked to Chris Bellman, I said, "Hey Chris Bellman, this sounds so good, it must be analog." And he says to me, it's digital. And so, that's not the first time I've gotten it wrong before. And it's got me curious. And I thought to myself, well, what would that sound like in comparison? I was sort of doubly interested because I had done more of kind of a slam dunk shootout a few weeks ago. Underwater Moonlight by the Soft Boys. This is a known problematic reissue. The one that known problematic reissue, and versus the 1980 original. And it didn't surprise me that it was just like shooting fish in a barrel. Like you could do an A/B comparison and be like, in this song you can hear this in the original and you cannot hear it in the reissue, or in the original it sounds like this, but then in the reissue it sounds like that. Just obvious, easy differences to find. It was just a matter of just like listening through, taking notes, and reporting on those notes. Different deal here with these. With these, so I got an original, and I gotta say, the original was cheaper than the reissue. And there's another one I'm going to also talk about where the opposite was true. This is another one I got this a few months ago. This is a 22 repress of a 2017 remaster, and the original was considerably more. So it can go both ways. I think it's more typical to go this way, that the originals are more expensive. And so there's a couple points I want to address before I get into the details. One is that how I look at analog versus digital, which is probably a bit outdated. So when I think of digital, the first thing that comes to my mind is still like a 1988 CD, which is unfair, right? Like that's not the world we live in anymore. Digital doesn't sound like 1988 CDs, thank God. Digital in 2022 is way, way, way higher resolution and way better processing. So where they how it's sampled and all that. And so like I drew these I drew these diagrams to try to illustrate how I think of analog versus digital. And this is maybe, well, let me just say, let's say this is analog sound wave, right? Like here's the actual sound wave. That is the sound wave. It's making a sound and it goes like that. This is a 1644, 80s digital representation of that sound wave, right? It still goes up and down. It does the same thing ultimately, but it misses out on some of the details, some of the actual, there's spaces in between, and it doesn't perfectly follow the line and all that. And then here is kind of sort of a representation of like modern high-res digital, right? So it's a much better approximation of that original wave, but it's still not the original wave. And so that's how I think of it. And I maybe have a little bit of um, unsophisticated view of what digital recording is. Like maybe this is maybe like an unfair oversimplification of it. So go ahead and yell at me if that's the case or whatever. But this more or less is how I think of it. And so my basic view then still is that a digital transfer of an analog recording is a reductive process. And it used to be a big reduction. Now it's less of a big reduction. Now it's an almost imperceptible reduction. So minimal that you might even be fooled into thinking that it hasn't happened. And that's how I look at it. But I got to admit that I sometimes forget that this exists. I often have this in my head when I'm thinking of digital, which is basically incorrect at this point, right? So I acknowledge all that. I talked a little bit about Underwater Moonlight, about how I did an A/B test, and that didn't work well at all for when comparing these albums. When comparing, I kind of want to get all four of these in my hands at once. See if I can do that, because I gotta get like a thumbnail picture too, right? This, and make some face like. So if you go like that, that gets the clicks, I think. But anyway, that turned out to be inadequate, and here's why I think that's the case. The differences are just too subtle to show up in an A/B test. And the way I ended up handling it was that, so first I was used to the digital reissues, and then I get the analog originals and I listen to them, and I think my first impression is I don't hear a difference. And I try to A/B them, and I'm still not hearing differences. And so then I decide to then just have the analog originals be my sort of day-to-day listening copy, and just listen to them daily for several days. And which I did, and then over time, it started to reveal itself. And so I look at it as something that's so subtle that you don't hear it first, and you don't hear in a like switching quick back and forth between the two. It's just much more of a subtle thing. And I expect that there may be some that find that to be petty. That's just like I'm splitting hairs. That I'm maybe sort of talking myself into hearing differences because I forked out the dough for the originals, and so I need to sort of justify that to myself. And I think there's a grain of truth in that, because the purpose of this video isn't to shit on the modern digital remasters, which, by the way, I should mention that are not at all sort of the fault of the cutting engineers here. So Chris Bellman cut the Shoot Out the Lights reissue. Chris Bellman cut this, and Ryan K. Smith cut this. And they can only, they can make their source material sound as good as they possibly can, but that's where the bottleneck is the source material. And if that reduction has already taken place before it's gotten to them, there's nothing they can do about it. And so it's not even the fault of the person who did the digital transfer. It's just the fact that the digital transfer happened caused this reduction to happen, in my opinion. And it's a super, super subtle one. One that's so subtle that it can lead you to believe that it maybe didn't happen. Like the reduction didn't happen. So my basic method ultimately was to listen to the analog originals for several days, and then listen to the digital remasters, and then see what I thought. And what I thought was that the digital remasters do an amazingly good job of trying to recreate the analog original, but they don't. And that the analog originals are just better. The CD, the CD, see, what would Freud say about that? The modern digital remasters, in a vacuum, without comparing them to the original, sound quite three-dimensional. They offer a sense of being in the room, and you hear all kinds of detail that you wouldn't hear on 80s CDs. And so they're really impressive. And modern high-res digital is really impressive. What I'll also say is that it's not quite there as good as it is. It's, although only in comparison with the analog original, when you hear the actual thing that hasn't suffered that reduction, however minimal that reduction is, the analog originals are even more three-dimensional. You even more get the sense of being in the room. And so then that begs the question, is it worth it? And the best I can say is that that's going to differ from person to person, and that for me, for at least for certain albums, it is. For albums that are really important to me, like Blank Generation, it's worth paying something like twice what you would pay for a high quality digital remaster. And you know, if Shoot Out the Lights had been really expensive, I probably would have balked at getting it. This ended up being $10, and the reissue was between 20 and 25. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember exactly what I paid. So, you know, at least in this case, it's a case of you get a better sounding copy for less. And that's kind of the paradigm, or that was the sort of the reality of the world when I was collecting records in my teens and 20s, is that it seems unbelievable now. But back then, this was just a cheap way to collect music. You know, this would have been $5 or less back then. And that would have been true across the board almost, of like, you can just get like great copies of stuff for around $5 or maybe $10 in general. You know, would Blank Generation have been that cheap? Probably not, but it, you know, it would have been less than $45, which I paid for it. So, man, there's just so much to talk about. It's easy to get lost, and I just get self-conscious about that, about trying to be succinct about it. Let me hit the pause button and try to gather my thoughts here. Yeah, so I guess I just want to just kind of summarize and just, in conclusion, say what is the take-home message I'm trying to deliver to you here. It is that I view digital as a reductive process, at least when you're dealing with stuff that's originally analog. That transferring to digital is reductive. It's now less reductive than it used to be. It's hardly reductive at all at this point. But when I do this comparison of these originals to these modern digital reissues, I hear a difference. It's very, very, very subtle, but I hear it, and I'd rather hear the thing that hasn't been reduced than the thing that was reduced, however minimal the reduction was, and however much it might even fool me if I hadn't heard the original. So there's that. It's a reductive process. 2, A/B tests have their place, but it's not everything. A/B tests are good when there are clear audible differences. When the differences are not so obvious and immediate, it's not as good of a test. And what I find personally to be most useful is to get used to the non-reduced one, the analog, and then hear the reduced one, and that's when it reveals itself. That's when you can hear that there's been some minimal, almost imperceptible reduction to digital. That's how I did it here, and that worked well, I think. Um, and that, however, each person kind of has to decide for themselves when is it worth it and when is it not. It's kind of a zero-sum game in terms of budget. Like if you have a certain budget per month or whatever, like I do, you can either get a bunch of records, although that's less and less the case. Records are getting so fucking expensive. There's that recent price increase that was announced by Universal. And then just like typical stuff is just getting to be so expensive. It's really making me wonder how much longer I'm going to be able to sort of really buy many records moving forward. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off of that tangent, but like, what was my point? Is that budgeting. That like you can either get, theoretically at least, more records of lower quality in general, or you can get fewer records of higher quality. In general, that's the case. There's going to be exceptions at the margins, but and so you got to figure out for yourself what's worth it for you. I would say in general that like for my favorite albums, like for Richard Held and the Voidoids, Blank Generation, I'm so glad that I have the original. I'm willing to pay that premium price to get an original because I want to hear that in a non-reduced form. I want to hear the actual music. I haven't come up with a good way to sort of encapsulate what I mean when I talk about that reduction. And so like anytime I try to make a shortcut version of that, it doesn't sound right, it doesn't feel right. It sounds like a little more insulting than I want it to be. And then with something like Shoot Out the Lights, a record that I like a lot, it'd be less important for me to get the original, but it turns out the original was cheaper than the reissue. So that was kind of a lesson learned here, is to pay more attention to that before getting a reissue. I think I tend to assume that like, well, if they're reissuing this, that must mean that like originals are hard to get. That's probably often the case, but that wasn't the case here. I could have saved myself that. Yeah, that's what I have to say about all this stuff. I hope I got everything. I really don't want to do another take. If you got this far, thanks so much for making your way through this. It's a complex issue, I think, and I'm doing my best to try to give you a succinct version of that. I hope it was somewhat successful. Losing my ability to speak. Thanks so much. So long.